Welcome to the Set to Lead podcast, the online mentoring platform for emerging and current leaders. My name is Marianne Samdi, leadership coach and talent development expert, and I will be your host. Welcome to the show, Diana.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for accepting and being a part of the show. I'm so pleased. Today, I want our listeners to get a better understanding about the future of work and some of the cross-cultural and cross-generational dynamics that are part of that. Start with sharing your background with our listeners.
Well, Marianne, I have been working for multiple decades, and I have worked in North America and Europe and have spent the last 2 decades living in Asia. So the cross-cultural thing I have experienced in spades, and now live in Hong Kong, married to a Chinese-born man and with 3 lovely children. And for the last decade or so, prior to going out on my own, was a regional director at Financial Times, managing teams across Asia. So in terms of the multi-generational, that came from writing the book Future Proof, Reinventing Work in an Age of Acceleration, and really tapped into the zeitgeist of people having to live longer, the sort of 100-year life, and having a very different approach to work. Based on the fact that people who are over 65 or over 50, as AARP terms it, still wanted to work. And meanwhile, the people that were younger entering the workforce were really thinking about, if I'm going to work so much longer, what is the rhythm of my work going to be? And that led to a lot of consulting and speaking about the multi-generational workforce.
Interesting. Very interesting background. I really find it interesting that you currently live in Hong Kong, and so I guess you're fluent in Chinese now?
Oh, well, Hong Kong is a place where you don't need to be fluent, and I did study Mandarin before going over and used to spend quite a lot more time in the mainland, so I speak sort of halfway decent Mandarin and street Cantonese. The Cantonese is the Chinese language that is spoken in Hong Kong. But it's sort of Portuguese versus Spanish. If you want to learn a language that is widely applicable, Mandarin is more useful, but Cantonese is still spoken as the main language from Hong Kong.
Well, good for you. So as a future of work expert, what are some of the upcoming trends we should get ready to manage?
Well, I think that as somebody who manages disruption and has for my entire career, from consulting to line management to entrepreneurship, adaptability, there's something called the AQ, your adaptability quotient, which is now, I guess, not replacing IQ and EQ or emotional quotient, but is really the key to thinking about the future of work. If you are no longer able to be in the same company, because statistically speaking, company lifespans are decreasing as ours are increasing, then you need to think about how you can be adaptable across, multiple careers, because you are likely to have multiple, potentially very different careers within your lifetime. Certainly multiple jobs, which you can't control because sometimes your company will have a shorter lifespan than your desired lifespan at that company. And really the adaptability to work across generations and across cultures and across the change that we see and business disruption that we see coming, and truly that has been part of work for the last several decades. So being adaptable is the most important thing. And what I wanted to do in my book, or I guess what readers wanted when I first started, was all right, great. People keep telling this to me, but what do I do now? And the idea of, really practical ideas of starting to build up a muscle for experimentation, which I spent a lot of time doing corporate innovation in my jobs and sort of in-house entrepreneur. And we would basically think about where we thought the world was heading. Think about what kind of things we might need to do to prepare, or what products we might offer, or if you're an individual, what skills you might have or what value you can offer. And then take small steps and small bets to see if that both is interesting to other people and also works for you, i.e., do you like it? Do you even like doing your work? And will people pay you for it? And taking those small experiments and building them up to reinventing yourself into adjacent opportunities, or reinventing yourself based on the new desires of the market. And then the sort of third thing was collaborating, because I think it's something that we take for granted and we need to work on with virtual and remote work, with, much more globalized work, with the advent of technology. And then focus, really how you focus in with less structure and more change to still be productive in a way that allows you to do work, but in the context of a satisfying life.
Right. We were talking a little bit before the show, not necessarily today, but we've had some conversations before. Yep. And I remember we were talking about cross-cultural communication dynamics and how you noticed that there's some strikingly differences between how Americans communicate in other cultures. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
So I think that's been the story of my life, and story of my personal life too. So yeah, I got a lot to say about that. But and in fact, went to Asia in 1999 based on a cross-cultural grant or scholarship, and so Americans are much more direct. I think that sometimes they're seen as naive because they just say things without really thinking about it. But that's true of all different cultures. So I've spent the last, I spent 10 years in a British organization and was surprised that was quite different. So my boss, who was American, we communicated very well. I knew exactly what he wanted. He was super direct. He never said please or thank you, really. In an email, it was one line, and some of the people around him would say, he's so brusque, right. And he would be like, why do we need to be dear so-and-so, please, thank you, my best regards? He was like, right. We're just working, right? We're all in it to get to an outcome in the most efficient way possible. Right. And efficiency is this value that we have, in particular in the U.S., which is not true. So it wasn't true necessarily in the British company context. And in the Chinese context, where relationships are so important, and in a lot of Asian cultures, where you have to build up a relationship before you can even get anything done and build up trust. Yeah, absolutely. And he was within a UK firm, so it's not like West versus East. It's really, it's about being sensitive to the surroundings and maybe having a conversation with people. Mm-hmm. But I train board directors, and one of the chairmen of a company in Malaysia and Australia, for instance, same person, companies are in the same industry. In Malaysia, he will go ahead and actually ask the most junior person on the board what their opinion is, and go from most junior to most senior. And after that, he will voice his opinion. Whereas in Australia, which is a very, feisty culture, he will put his opinion out there, and the rest of the board will argue robustly around it. And so that's just sort of the leadership required to understand the cultural environment in which you operate. One in which people will be very excited to debate with you, and another culture where if you are the most senior person and you have an opinion, nobody will go against you ever, because that's not the way it works.
Do you find that when you work with international organizations that have teams across the board, that they spend a lot of time training their leaders on how to deal with these cross-cultural dynamics?
Nope. I don't. I think that there are opportunities for improvement. What happens that I've seen many times is that we talk. We don't do it about remote working. I mean, we're really not. We're really lagging, I guess. We've all gotten leadership training that allows us to manage teams or to collaborate, but the environment is so different in terms of the type of people we work with and understanding it. Partly it's overwhelming, right? How do you do that? Who do you decide to train that way? Do you train them beforehand? You give them an assignment? I do, and people say, "Oh, I'm not in a global role, or I'm not in a global position." And I think my argument has just been, it's all going that way. You cannot afford to be insular, because even if you are not working globally, the sort of trope, I'm going to just have a little cupcake shop in my neighborhood and I never have to deal with any of this stuff again. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, the price of wheat is based on a lot of different factors. Look at the coronavirus in China right now.
Right.
Will change, and the U.S.-China trade relationship will change agricultural prices. And your price of wheat is directly related to that. You cannot afford to have your head in the sand.
Right.
And for people in the knowledge economy, or even for the cupcake, bakery owner, you may be going on to Fiverr and having somebody do your website that's in the Ukraine or India, or maybe you have somebody else that, it's just a totally different world we live in. So I do like one, I think it's quite overwhelming, and I understand that. And I have the sort of joy of having many decades of learning on the job and through training. So a lot of people think, well, where do I start? That seems really overwhelming. I like the idea of just-in-time learning instead of just-in-case learning, right? The just-in-case learning is, oh my gosh, what if that does happen? I might need to know that. And we start getting like training in everything, and you can learn things just in time. If you want to do something where you're going to work with people internationally, maybe that's the time for you to learn more about at least the culture that you're going to be working with in a small way. And that kind of micro-learning and those micro-learning moments are important. You don't need to get a degree in cross-cultural communication in order to get on Fiverr and book a website designer outside the U.S.
Right. So let's stay there for a few minutes longer, Diana. So for Americans who are trying to build strong relationships with those in the APAC regions, whether they're the cupcake owner, where they're, the small business owner who's creating a website, or maybe even a big business owner who's creating a website, what are some communication styles that they should keep in mind when they're dealing with folks in those regions?
Well, Asia is a region, but it's not one country. And in my experience, I covered 17 markets, and all of them have their nuances in terms of, sales and pricing. It's a fairly fragmented market, so I don't want to overgeneralize.
Okay.
I think the thing that's been most important is to understand and invest in your own communication skills, and to ask questions and to ask the right questions. So many people assume it will be the same, or assume that the process that they have is, that what happens everywhere. And so in speaking to people overseas, understanding that that they don't know your process or they may not know your process, and investing in communication skills, over communicating, clarifying expectations. Those are some of the things that I see working really well, not just in Asia, but, or Asia to the U.S., but really across the board. And they're the kind of things you take for granted if you're in the same room. And I've been in the same room with my team and then, have had virtual team members. And it's amazing how much you can cover just by being in the same room and with proximity. And then the second thing is relationships. If you are working with people and they're part of your company, and I see this actually right now with what they're calling the world's largest work-at-home experience with China and Hong Kong largely working at home, mm-hmm. People want to be quite transactional in their business and they want to be efficient. But the thing that works better is by setting aside some time to also build those relationships. And that, I think, is really important, more important in Asia more generally than it is in North America, where contract-based law is sort of the most important thing, whereas in Asia, the relationships matter. And instead of just having the call for us to do the transaction, it's about if you have somebody on a team or on a project, taking the time to just have a call where we talk about our lives or what's going on or let me learn about you as a person.
I see, less transactional and more relational.
Yeah.
So to speak. I see.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you prevent from crossing boundaries when you're trying to build relationships outside of some of the transactions that you want to discuss? Is there any fear of becoming too personal and trying to build those relationships when you're dealing with another culture?
Absolutely. I think that there is always that potential. I had a person who was on my staff, for instance, and it is not so much about crossing the personal boundaries. Mm-hmm. I think for the personal boundaries, just saying that, hey, I love to get to know you more. Just let me know if we're talking and, anything's off limits or if I say something wrong, just tell me, and that's difficult sometimes for people to respond to. But for instance, when you do build that kind of relationship, and I'll give you an example from my own experience, one of the people on my team was doing an exceptional job, and I report to London, and she reports to me in a different Asian country, and she said, after I sent an email to my bosses praising her, and an email to my bosses in London, she said, that's so embarrassing to me. I really wish you wouldn't do that because I just feel like, in my culture, it just feels kind of cringy, right, for me to be out there tooting my own horn. And I said, no, you have to understand, I respect that, but you need to get some stuff done. And the only way that these people are going to pay you mind is if I socialize the fact that you are an important person and you will get things done, and you don't have to toot your own horn, but I need to do a little bit of it. So being able to contextualize and explain some of those things and be that sort of explain your own culture, kind of be able to say, hey, I'm American, so I might seem really direct to you. If this, please don't take it the wrong way, is an example. Just being quite honest about it and understanding that the way you may come across may be interpreted differently, and being upfront about that and having it out in the open.
That's insightful. I like those tips there. Putting things into context and understanding who you are or how people typically perceive Americans and contextualizing that before you move forward.
Yeah, I think it's really useful, and it allows other people to say the same thing. Yeah. So another example that's from one of the companies I've worked with, the board level interestingly, was all different countries, and we did an exercise with them as to what kind of communication. So one of the things that we talked about on our previous call was the fact that you can do in intercultural surveys sort of a pendulum swing between expressive and restrained communication and direct and indirect.
Yes.
And this particular organization had the leaders being very direct and inexpressive, which is considered a stereotypical Western, viewpoint. And the staff were largely indirect and expressive. So the staff would say things to the leaders, and it was so indirect that they didn't understand it. And they would say, yeah, they withhold information. And, the staff they didn't feel safe. The direct questioning was intimidating to them. So they're being able to say, hey, this is the way that we're working. It may be too direct, gives the opportunity for people to say, well, we're trying to tell you this, but we're not ever going to be putting it out there so directly. This is the way we may be telling you, that kind of thing is useful. Those conversations need to happen in a multicultural environment, and they need to happen in a multi-generational environment so that you don't, as one of my clients did, design an entire thing for millennials that completely misses the mark because you haven't had the conversations beforehand. You've made assumptions.
That's interesting. I think that what you're suggesting is absolutely on point. However, I've been in similar environments to you, Diana, where this type of dialogue is necessary, but no one knows how to facilitate it. So in the example that you just gave, the staff was communicating in an indirect fashion, whereas the board was more direct. I think that it would be very rare to find someone on the staff who would actually know themselves that way enough to say to the board, we have an indirect communication style. Someone would have to be in the middle to probe that out of them, right?
So what usually happens, and you're totally right, we did this with the leaders of this organization, and we didn't know what was wrong, right? It always starts with some kind of problem, some kind of the staff aren't doing something, or the leaders, that basically it's manifesting as some kind of symptom in the company, like there's a lack of innovation even though the CEO says that's what he wants, or whatever it is. And then going in to actually work with these groups of people and talk about it is usually when some of this comes out. You never know what's going to come out. I've been a consultant since the early 90s. And generally, there's the process aspect and the people aspect. And the thing that I always love is where process meets people, because that's usually where it breaks down.
Right.
And that's what happens. That's why people are so valuable from the outside to come in and sort of ask these questions. That's why a board is valuable, to ask questions about what's going on, to really get to the heart of how people are interacting and communicating. Can be across cultures and across generations, and that's what I've made my work. But even within smaller organizations where people are pretty homogeneous, communication issues happen. And, I think that it takes a trained facilitator oftentimes to have that kind of breakthrough for your company and for your team and for your management.
Yes, for sure. So with the future of work, we've talked a little bit about some of the communication dynamics that occur. I know you're also an expert around how to manage the generational issues that come with the future of work. We talked in a prior conversation about this term called the modern elder. Tell our audience about what that means, the modern elder.
So the reality behind the modern elder is that people are living longer, their healthy lifespans are longer, and most people in the U.S. in particular, there's a statistic about how people have not saved more than sort of $400 for a rainy day. And for people who are older and may not want to retire, they're really struggling. If it used to be that we would have pretty simple careers, that retirement age was 65, we would live till 70, and we had enough savings. Well, now there is less safety in careers. There are a lot of places, less so in America, but in Europe, where retirement age might be 50 even, or 55, and you're going to live to be 80, 90, 100. So all of a sudden, people, they need to work more financially, and they would like to work more because work does give us a lot more than just our financial means. In many respects, it allows you to be part of a community, and it allows you to be continue contributing, et cetera. And so there's this segment, and actually the segment of, I think, 55 plus is the fastest growing segment of the workforce in the U.S. And so it's something that people and companies are really grappling with. What do you do with people who are between 50 and 75, say, or 50 and 100? Just to be inclusive, what is it that how are they going to contribute to the organization? These are usually people who are really senior. They don't necessarily want to work more. And so that category of a modern elder is somebody who's really seen a lot, has great wisdom, and partnering with some of the other people in the organization to be that modern elder, to be the elder that sort of says, okay, you have these great ideas, but I've seen 4 to 6 economic cycles, and let me tell you what happened. I'm not telling you what needs to happen now, but let's talk about it in context again. That is a role that I see people at the end of their careers taking more, taking it on as a role, either within a company or as advisors to companies, advisors to startups, as consultants, et cetera. That's the modern elder.
Do you see the same amount of age bias in the APAC regions as it is in America? Is that a big issue? Mm-hmm.
So it's a thing, but it's a little bit different. And the interesting thing that I've seen in Chinese culture, in particular, is the idea that your elderly parents, it's more of a family bias, that your elderly parents shouldn't have to work. And so if you're elder, because you should be able to take care of them as the child. And so if they are working, then it's embarrassing. And so it's an interesting thing. It is also on the employer's part, like, oh, here's an older person. On a very basic level, I think that the assumptions are that they're older, they're more senior in the career, so they probably have to be paid more. They're inflexible. All these different biases are international. But you add that, like, oh, I don't want my parents to work because then I look like a bad kid, is an additional cultural layer that we're grappling with in Hong Kong and China. And I do think it's something that we're educating our way out of. The idea that people do have something to add, that they're not, and that is the idea of the modern elder, that they're not, just because maybe they didn't grow up with the technology and interconnection and whatnot that we value from people who are just in the beginning of their careers, that are digital natives, doesn't mean that there aren't some significant assets to be had. And it varies individually, but let me tell you an example of a company that I think is doing an amazing job. So most companies are looking at their older workforce. These are senior people, and they get paid a lot. Either they've been in the company a long time or whatnot. Insurance is a big issue. Oh gosh, we have to pay health insurance and life insurance, and these people have potentially higher health risk, et cetera. So that's another cost. So there's a lot of that aspect to worrying about senior leaders. Mercer, which is an HR consultancy, has looked at their retired population and noticed that they really want to stay working, so has developed a consulting consortium of Mercer executives that are retired and don't want to work full-time, but can consult on projects that Mercer clients are interested in that Mercer may not want to take on, fully, maybe the smaller projects, et cetera. And they field those out to their retirees, and they know that the quality will be the same, and they know the Mercer, expectations, and they can still work, but they can also go and take a month in the Bahamas if they want, or whatever it is.
Right.
I think those kind of arrangements will become more commonplace. And in fact, Mercer's trying it for itself, and then we'll roll it out to clients because they feel like that's a good solution for the modern elder.
Right. So we might see popping up more organizations when you talk about contractors and consultants. Maybe they just hire retirees and use those retirees for the projects that come in. Because I don't see a lot of consulting agencies that focus on that.
There are more and more as you go along. I would say there's expert networks, for instance, and those folks have traditionally focused on, seasoned executives. So GLG, Links is another one that's come up, and that has been spend like an hour with somebody, pay them $300 to $500 US, and get their expertise. They're now moving into consulting projects and even recruitment, as people are looking for people with, more specific expertise or more seasoning to work with them on projects. In my opinion, a lot of companies will have a smaller core staff and use outside consultants much more readily to be more resilient and flexible. Mm-hmm. And teams will come to form for specific outcomes and then go on to different projects in the same way that maybe a consulting firm does. That will be a much more prevalent model. And you can see it in workspaces now.
Right.
When I was in consulting, we hot desked, we spent most of the time with the client. You see, as people work from home and are more flexible now, the footprint of real estate shrinking, and people hot desking, even though they have more, of a line role. But they just move around, and maybe they'll be off and working at home sometimes. And, that is sort of the wave of the future, I think.
Yeah. One last question for you, Diana, because we've been talking a while. Do you think a modern elder and a modern young professional can coexist together in the workplace?
Well, elders and young people have coexisted for centuries, so I don't think that
necessarily peacefully.
There is that. That's a good point, Marianne. I think that hierarchy has in the past been used to teach people their roles. And in fact, in society, there's been a lot of different hierarchies, a sort of gender-based and race-based and age-based. And I think that is changing. I think that we are in a transition period and that we are having to redefine some of that. And it's not always easy, but it is absolutely possible. And it takes a tremendous amount of communication and understanding, and those skills are at a premium. And we now have time to do that because a lot of the rote skills are automated, and our humanity, and our ability to work with other people is at a premium. So I do think that older and younger people, if they realize that and don't try to say, I just need to do my job, now your job is to relate to people, because technology can do a lot of the other stuff.
Hmm.
So I do. I have great hope, and I think that young people and modern young people and modern elders really can work together. They just need to invest a little bit of time in understanding each other.
Exactly. Well, we're at the end of our show today, Diana. Before we leave, how can our listeners follow you?
They can follow me by going to my website, dianawudavid.com, dianawudavid.com. And if they would like to go there, there's a future-proof checklist, and you can see just how future-ready you are and have a few things that will allow you to kickstart your path to future-proof.
Well, thanks, Diana. I appreciate that. Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you, Marianne. Always a pleasure to speak to you.